Okay, thank you so much for being here today for the second lecture in this small series that is opening up the Chaire SFPI for the new share holder, Jérôme Warren. Jérôme started this summer, as most of you know, as a Chaire SFPI holder here at the Académie Royale de Belgique. Jérôme is surrounded by a very supporting group of members of the Academy, mostly from the class Technology and Society, but also someone from the classe des lettres who's going to appear soon enough. It's Kenneth Bertrams. Most of these members are not here because the dates were not good for them, but especially I thank you for being here, for being present, my colleague Véronique Cabiot, my colleague Bruno Coleman, and thank you to all of you for being here to start this process with Jérôme. I'm also especially happy that Martin Brabant is here to represent the SFPI, because this is some work that is developing in the service of the questions, the issues that the SFPI is asking to itself, but also totally independently, because the SFPI supports this share as part of fundamental research, and there is no strings attached, let's say, except for being useful to the joint discussion, the joint issues that we care about. So last week, Jérôme set the framework within which he is proposing to tackle the issue of how to conceive the key dimensions of what is or what should be a sustainable firm. And the understanding of sustainability is very much grounded in a dual understanding of sustainability being having social dimensions and environmental dimensions at the firm level. And so today is going to deliver a second lecture that will help us understand better what he has in mind in terms of practical dimensions, practical relevance, and ongoing research. So Jérôme, as I understand, will speak for about an hour, and then we'll have a small hour. Probably we'll take a short break just to breathe, but we will immediately follow up with an exchange so that we can build up together the questions that arise from these two lectures, and which will help Jérôme orient his work for the next 2 years. So thank you very much for being present, and Jérôme, the floor is yours.
Merci Isabelle, and thank you all for being here. I apologize that my French is not sufficient to give such a complex lecture. And let me just also say that it's an honor to give this in the Salle Ilia Prigogine, who certainly is a figure that I will try to include in my remarks, and who's a fascinating individual. I give a brief maybe shout out as well to Camille, who pointed out to me this beautiful wallpaper, which I had adorned my doctoral dissertation with, is not from William Morris, but in fact his daughter, who I won't mention in the talk, but who is certainly part of the spirit which I hope to bring to this research. So my talk, of course, is entitled Delivering on the Promise of a Sustainable Firm, Surveying Practices to Establish a Research Agenda. So last week, I focused mainly on, it was a very verbose, you could say, a talk on history, theory, a lot of ideas. And today I wanted to move to the practical arena and implement some of these ideas, or question how that is possible. So just to review from last week, many of you were not here. I talked about and citing particularly the research of Philippe de Wood, whom many of you are aware of, I'm sure, who called for a new raison d'être of the firm. I sort of sketched out what this could be in relation to particularly the work of Isabel Ferreras, as well as that of Mariana Mazzucato, talking about missions, the mission economy. Of course, I presented here this wedding cake, as it has been called, from the University of Stockholm, in Sweden version of the United Nations, the Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs, with the intention of representing that these are not all equal. Oftentimes they're presented like the menu at McDonald's. You have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and so on. But of course, there is some interdependence and some priorities, so to speak, with these goals. And so the idea of deliberation in terms of distributing those constraints, which they will entail, and they do entail in everyday practice, was something I discussed. I also laid out 2 different visions of the firm. The first is a neoclassical one, seeing the firm as a machine. One could use that metaphor with input factors coming together via contracts, and the notion, of course, embodied by Frederick Taylor's idea of scientific management. On the other side, the relational view of the firm, which sees the firm more as a network with investors, various kinds of investors. There are labor investors, capital investors, even consumers can be seen as investing relationships. And that's the point, that instead of relationships, we emphasize instead of contracts, we emphasize the relationships, and management as a meta relation or a relation of relations, as Joseph Wieland has called it. And these are just 2 books to represent those 2 views. Of course, I mentioned Frederick Taylor. Many of you, I'm sure, are aware of his ideas on management. And this is a new book that was actually just out this year, The Relational View of Economics, edited by Lucio Biguero and a number of other colleagues. And all of these perspectives that I presented last week, all of them except the triple helix, which I will very briefly introduce today, relational economics, the idea of sustainable development that Philip de Voet emphasizes, the mission economy that Mariana Mazzucato brings to the table, as well as Isabel Ferreras with democratizing work. I feel they share the common factor of communication as an important factor, basically, in an organization. Why? So, of course, you have stakeholders in an organization, and you have to prioritize their interests. Just 2 very almost arbitrary examples. There was a very absurd situation a few years ago during the Trump administration where there was a fight between the state of California, which had more strict emission standards, and the federal government under Trump, who, again, canceled or stopped these higher standards. At the same time, the auto industry, who one could see, in the short term at least, would benefit from lower standards, actually appealed to have those returned, because, of course, they're thinking of the long term, and they're also thinking about their international markets. So, of course, there will be more regulations in the future that will be stricter, so they will actually be at a disadvantage if they have less standards locally. So at the same time, the German Federal Court, I think it was 2 years ago, ruled that the German government has not been suitably or justly dealing with the interests of future generations in its policies. It actually demanded that future generations, in terms of climate policy, be integrated more fully into the policy of the government. So these are just 2 examples to show that stakeholders may not always be present in the deliberations, and because of space or because of time, because we're talking about future generations or the global market. At the same time, I wanted to elaborate a bit more on the notion of multi-stakeholding. Again, if we're talking about stakeholder interests and we're talking about prioritizing, there is some importance in formalizing these ideas. So just to return very briefly to this classical model of economics, John Stuart Mill, a famous philosopher, economist, thinker, suggested that the point of political economy was restricted to pecuniary interests of individuals. So where individuals are increasing their wealth, this is where economics or political economy should base itself. Now, this idea, very restricted in a utilitarian sense, was actually can be seen in the history of the labor movement, even with Sidney and Beatrice Webb, who in fact in their formulation of the British labor movement were very strictly interested in dividing out the agency of different stakeholders. So workers had trade unions, consumers had cooperatives, and the political arena had politicians who were all separated out into their tripartite division. And in fact, this notion, which of course is taught in economics textbooks as well, was very much unchallenged, even in the left. until the 1960s, where you had these tumultuous years of rebellion. Even here in Belgium, of course, there were a lot of events that I'm sure many of you are familiar with. And in fact, I wanted to just stop very briefly on one individual. That's Franco Basaglia, an Italian psychiatrist who was very, why am I talking in an economics lecture about a psychiatrist? Because he actually had an impact on the Italian economy. And in fact, he started as a director of a psychiatric hospital in the north, in Gorizia, actually at this time on the Yugoslavian border, and basically turned this institution around by including the perspective of the patients and not merely maintaining the hierarchical relationship of doctor to patient. And in fact, he himself very heavily personally contributed to the closure of Italy's mental institutions, which was completed at the end of the 1970s. And in the 1991, actually, a law was developed for social cooperatives, which took over much of the mental health work in Italy. And this actually spread dramatically internationally. There were other countries, France, Canada, and many others who then adopted this multi-stakeholder or social cooperative idea, and which allows to internalize many of the effects that an economic interaction actually might otherwise not do so. We talk about externalities. So these are things that an interaction does not include. And in fact, this dynamic is, in my opinion, very significant in the current environment with the knowledge economy, where we do need more of an explicit embedding of a multi-stakeholder logic within organizations. And in fact, when you do see things like the retreating of the state through either fiscal austerity or other types of policies, these types of multi-stakeholder organizations can actually serve as a bridge between a failing state and a failing market, and they have done so in many cases, which I will outline briefly. The triple helix, very, very briefly, it was mentioned at the Euro case by one of the speakers a few weeks ago, is basically a concept that focuses on the interactions that result, rather on the processes or dynamics that result from interactions. So we have, for instance, here 3 different entities. You have the university, you have industry, you have government. They each have their own logic. Industry, perhaps, if we assume, like the neoclassicals do, is maximizing profit or some certain products that are being produced. Government is regulating, and industry, the university is producing novelties or ideas. There can be mutually beneficent projects that are created. There could be a project-based collaboration. Over the long term, through this project-based collaboration, new codes of conduct, a new lexicon is developed that then again spills back onto these individual institutions themselves and allows for more a holistic collaboration in the future. This is Norbert Wiener's version of Claude Shannon's communications graph representing what is happening in communication. He adds the additional layers of basically codes that are what results from this interaction. So, in fact, what is resulting is not just communication, but they are codes. And Kenneth Arrow, I cited him last week, actually calls these codes of conduct in capital investment. So, of course, firms have certain ways of responding to events and certain ways of coding information. And again, through these interactions, these types of the horizon of interactions can actually increase. So this is the type of mindset that I would suggest. And here on the bottom right, of course, the costs of cooperation reduce and the ability to generate more of a cooperative rent increases, of course, through these types of interactions. In Belgium, in fact, you have in the East in Eupen, also mentioned last week, this citizens' assembly. So this is one way to immediately introduce the multi-stakeholder dialogue into the political arena. And of course, Ireland has had some success moving beyond the intransigence of the political arena, for instance, legalizing gay marriage and abortion at a time where this was impossible for the political institutions to do so. So, in fact, these types of triple helix events or processes can actually be quite effective in moving beyond institutional inertia. And so, coming back, Here, in fact, on the right, you see a graph that puts guard labor. So these are, security guards, people who are basically paid to maintain relations of the status quo, relative to inequality in several countries. Belgium is somewhere in the middle, probably a little bit higher than it would be because of the EU institutions, I'm guessing. But you do see a definite relation here. So less equal societies pay more for protecting property. Very easy to understand. On the bottom, it's United States cities, so more equal cities have less need for guard labor. One way to embed these types of multi-stakeholder logics, in my opinion, if we look at the level of the firm, is changing the nature of particularly the employment relation or other types of relations within the firm. So in Belgium, as in most other countries, you really have two types of employment relation. You're self-employed or you're employed at a company. Now, in the Basque region of Spain, which has a large tradition of cooperatives, worker cooperatives, there is actually a third category of associated labor, which means this is a worker who owns the company or has a stake in the company and is at the same time a worker. So there are ways to move beyond the informal and formal institutional structures that allow us to embed this type of multi-stakeholder logic in firms. So moving to the level of investment, I like to begin very basically in these discussions. Last week I asked, what is a firm? This week I asked, what is investment? And it's a very basic function of capitalism, or really any economic system that wishes to continue to exist. And it either expands or replaces the capital stock. And this very basic definition, which I don't find very satisfying, it says nothing about how inclusive or extractive, on the other hand, these particular investments are, as Darren Acemoglu and Robinson have commented. And in fact, Steve Keen, maybe the first reference to Prigozhin today is Steve Keen talking about unrepeatable experiments. And of course, if we have I could get to the thermodynamics of unrepeatability here, what that means. So we're looking into the future. We have little time to deal with these important issues of the climate and of inequality. So there is an importance to what is being invested on the general scale of society. Schumpeter has a distinction that he makes between invention and innovation. And of course, some of you may be aware of this in his theory of economic development. He suggests that somebody may tinker in their garage and make something new. And this is not what he calls innovation. Innovation to him is bringing something to the market. According to a subscription to this relational economics paradigm, this definition of innovation would be somewhat widened. And I'm much more privy to this notion that Joseph Wieland places of defining innovations as any process or event that affects the duration, ability, or willingness for individuals to cooperate. So really, this can be a technical feat like a smartphone where you can call someone or send them a message, or it can be, again, a new linguistic feature or cultural trait that brings people together. So I think one of my suggestions, and again, I'm not coming down as Moses from the mountain to present, the real news. This is just my suggestion. This is a process itself. But investing in process, I think, is something that should be foregrounded by institutions that have a long scale focus and the ability to do that. So outcome-oriented social interventions and learning that results from that is part of that. And these particularly can actually not necessarily grow a network making more jobs, creating more jobs, for instance, but changing the density of network connections, changing the way that people interact. Things like the Ost-Belgian model that I mentioned, the East Belgian model, where you basically are activating citizens to participate more directly in the economic process. This is a form of investment in society and in a future-oriented vision of society. So economic juries are part of that as well. They were created in, I think, the United States and Germany in a parallel way in the 1970s. And in fact, if we are moving to a notion of public work, as Isabel Ferreras has said in her work, moving away from the private to the public, the quality of connections really does matter. And people talk about human capital, and I think this is really what we're talking about when we speak of such things in many cases. So rethinking this public and private nature that I mentioned last week with reference to Otto von Gierke really requires seeing investment as a public function and serving society as a whole. And in this regard, I would cite the American philosopher John Dewey, who says that the problems of democracy are usually solved with more democracy. And of course, he doesn't mean any particular system or mechanism by that. The institution of democracy changes and evolves over time. So we had 50 years ago the Meadows report from the Club of Rome, which talks about the physical limits to growth. A lot of economists debate these issues, and really they're sidetracked on issues like GDP, when this report was really talking about the physical limits to growth, which do exist. We're on one planet. We don't have a second planet. And again, these facts mean that these scarce investments, they have to be allocated looking at the balance between social and particular individual needs and priorities. And this, to me, suggests that we must include in our return on investment notions like resilience that I discussed last week, viability, and even discourse. So I think investment in what I refer to as democratic choice mechanisms, DCMs, should be a significant part of that. And on the right, this is not a Mondrian picture in the Modern Gallery of Art. This is Oliver Dowland's representation of the role of lottery in making choices, and he calls lottery a blind break. Of course, in ancient Greece, they used lotteries to fill most of the political positions, including juries, senators, other types of positions. And the point is when you have here, it's 4 choices, you're removing the ability for all of us to enter our biases and elements of discrimination and so on, including our intelligence, of course. So it's an irrational, what he calls Dowland calls an irrational blind break. And this is, again, one tool that can be used, again, to move beyond organizational inertia. And in fact, there are people like Simon Peck, a colleague from British Columbia, professor of business, who has written on the potential for introducing sortition into firms, actually as a tool for making for instance, executives more accountable and representative to the stakeholders, to workers and to others as well. And he has co-founded the organization Democracy in Practice that goes, for instance, to schools and does basically experiments with lotteries for selecting the school president and these types of things. And they've had a lot of success with that. I myself have been working with the Bachelor's in Leadership and Innovation that was developed by Mondragon, Team Academy and university as well, to introduce some element of sortition into their selection of team leaders. And they've been very receptive to that. Last week we discussed, there were some questions relating to ESG and the issue, what should we make of ESG? And I wanted to get some critical perspectives here because I think these are very important. You can always go to an investors meeting and hear great things about different things, but I think it's when you have an outside perspective that information basically enters the discussion. And there are critical analytical discussions of the existing frameworks, including the EU taxonomy, that do show the importance of exactly what I've been talking about, of including democratic processes into the construction of these phenomena. And so if we are designing and implementing new regimes of sustainability, I do propose that it requires this triple helix or multi-stakeholder logic, and that you can't just allow market forces to regulate the outcome. So again, the EU taxonomy, many have applauded it as a step in the right direction, and others, of course, are not happy with certain outcomes. We've heard about issues like nuclear power and gas being considered sustainable. So to me, this speaks to the need of including citizen participation in the creation of these taxonomies ex ante from the beginning. And secondly, ESG, of course, there have been some criticisms. Alec Schmidt, I think is his name, at NYU, has suggested that there is a divergence with actual market performance. So those investors who are interested both in market performance and, environmental, social, and governance issues may find it difficult to balance these things while using an ESG analysis as they are produced today. And he also laments or critiques that these ratings are dramatically different from organization to organization, so that there is very low, what one would say, standardization. At the same time, it's largely an unregulated market that leads, in many cases, and historically it's been the case, to greenwashing. And I just would mention Mariana Mazzucato's upcoming book, where she talks about the role of, or she will talk about the role of consultant agencies and similar organizations that actually remove agency from public institutions and others by acting as a middleman, and will tell you what's sustainable and so on. So there really is a need to have some regularity there and some regulation, in fact. At the same time, Alex Edmonds at the London Business School has just, I think, in the last weeks offered it. So it's a working paper. It's actually, I think, in the top 10 at the moment at SSRN. So a lot of people are talking about this paper, that ESG should in fact not be prioritized over long-term value strategies or indicators. And he says, in fact, there is no such thing as ESG investing, only ESG analysis of various investments. He critiques, furthermore, that it is too quantitative, that it does not include things like work quality and other intangibles like camaraderie at the workplace, and that this may in fact lead to boards and executives actually maximizing certain outcomes and neglecting certain other ones, especially if their pay is then tied to ESG indicators. This danger would be quite significant. And he concludes that we need good companies, not companies good at ESG. Another criticism of ESG is that it does not explicitly include waste. Waste is a very difficult factor to measure, because, of course, waste management is done by many informal local organizations, and there's a diversity of quality of information. At the same time, it's a huge problem. And in fact, over 90% of the products and packaging that is produced actually do not re-enter the business, not the business cycle, but well, if we talk about a circular economy, we're really failing at that. And the UN actually found between 1970 and 2000 that the amount of waste had more than doubled. And so it would be quite beneficial if ESG in the future would focus more explicitly on the role of waste. And instead of the E here, in E, of course, environment focuses mainly on issues like net zero, energy consumption, and materials use, because these are more easily measurable. And then last, I found this post actually just from a few days ago on the Oxford Business Law blog, Can Shareholders Save Capitalism?, where an author here asks, actually, should we trust those who are largely responsible for many of the problems of sustainability today with solving those problems? And maybe the answer is inherent in the title here. So just looking at some other options, one is the idea, of course, Gar Alperovitz, the American historian, has developed of the Cleveland model, he calls it. The city of Cleveland, of course, a large industrial center that suffered greatly from deindustrialization, has since shifted to a service-based economy, and there are local community-based trusts that fund, for instance, worker cooperatives that themselves are supported by local institutions like universities and hospitals. And for instance, there's a laundry service that tries to reduce the use of water and uses ecologically friendly detergents, and that is whose client is the local hospital. So the idea is keeping money flowing locally and building local-based assets. And Alperovitz, of course, has been very outspoken about this model as an alternative to both the sort of free market, laissez-faire capitalism on the one side, and this state-run socialism that of course, collapsed in 1991 on the other. So his question that he usually asks is, if we don't want this and we don't want that, what is the alternative? And he, of course, has some ideas as to what that alternative would look like. The role of the state, I think, is quite important, as well as that of investors like SFPI and others. And I mentioned the 7 points that Mariana Mazzucato makes in her mission economy, things like long-term finance and new notions of partnership and so on. I don't want to review all of them today. And the state can help with almost all of these. It can actually engage in value creation, shaping markets through long-term finance, and by the sanctioning or desanctioning function of legislation and contract or procurement, public procurements. The example, of course, that Mazzucato uses is the Apollo missions. With regards to long-term finance, I think it's important to reflect on actually the 12th chapter of Keynes's general theory, where he distinguishes between what he calls enterprise and speculative investment. So the enterprise investment would be a long-term investment, and I think this is exactly the role of such public institutions, as well as what Keynes calls the multiplier effect, the fact that you can actually have large-scale impact as such organizations as a state. Each dollar or euro that you spend can actually go much further than just within one single enterprise. So just looking at some practical options, procurement, as I said, that could be one thing that is respective of such missions, sustainably, that are sustainable in the social and in the ecological sense. There could be a pluralistic scope of organizations that are addressed. The organizations like cooperatives, some representatives of the International Cooperative Alliance should have been here today. One was sick with COVID, unfortunately. But social enterprises, even groups of firms, a plurality should be addressed by these procurements. And I've had some conversations with some individuals here in the room on the Belgian Company Law, which has recently been changed in 2019. The old company law had, some would say, rather obscure boundaries between different firm types. So this had some benefits and some disadvantages. And one advantage is that it was quite pluralistic. There's quite a bit of gray area between different types of firms. At the same time, there was some moral hazard, some incidences of fake cooperatives, for instance. And one of the aspects that I found most interesting was this notion of a company with a social purpose. And this has been removed in the new company law in 2019, which has more clear distinctions between different types of firms, which allows less wiggle room, has more of a centrifugal, I guess it would be, organization, and also returns to a more traditionalist reading of cooperatives itself. And the question is, was there enough pluralistic ambition in this new definition? And one suggestion that I've heard, Josef, you made, is that perhaps some stakeholders were consulted quite late in the process of deliberation, such that the law itself may need improvement again. So nevertheless, it seems possible still within the new company law that the winning bid for such a procurement, or winning bids, it could be an entire ecosystem of investments, would need to introduce this mission that the investor would suggest into its bylaws. And it could also extend a mission-oriented reporting into those bylaws. And at the same time, as far as I know, in my reading, the use of variable share classes is still possible in the new company law. And so this would give, for instance, SFPI or other patient investors an opportunity to veto any changes to the bylaws that specifically affect these two domains, the mission and the reporting on that mission. It would not have to be majority stake, and I think private companies already do things like this. I heard Philips, for instance, the technology company, does some sort of ecosystem investing in this way. And also, as I mentioned, these types of economic juries could also be introduced here to decide on which missions or which particular investments should be selected. So Pat Devine talks about negotiated coordination bodies, or NCBs, which are subsidiaristic. One could actually organize these at the sector level, at the national level, at the firm level, So it's possible to integrate this actually in order to save perhaps some of the resources of institutions that would be deciding all the time on some or another investment, including the public, might again be a way to internalize those costs. And I've been talking a lot about cooperatives, maybe just to focus on them for a moment. All this talk about global social responsibility and other things seems to me that cooperatives are a great example for as an investment tool or vehicle, and they did arise as problem solvers in the origins of the capitalist model that we live in. There were a lot of problems with not only of exploitation at the workplace, but also denaturing of products. So people were not sure of the quality of the bread that they purchased or the milk that they drank. So bakers would put sawdust in the wheat in order to get a higher price for lower quality. And so cooperatives like the Toad Lane cooperative in Rochdale, founded in 1844 here on the right, were founded in many ways to solve these problems by bringing citizens together to purchase, to work, to live together in a way that, again, dealt with these issues that we call today moral hazard. And so the cooperative principles I interpreted, I won't go into the details, as a coordinated equilibrium that in fact responds to random events non-randomly. So if we have an event Y, some random business might respond in some way to this event Z, it's covered up here. But with the principles, in fact, they prevent, or they encourage certain other responses to these events. And so the question is, can a cooperative macroculture, an evolutionary concept, be a part of such a sustainable investment strategy? And just as an example, Höganäs is a world leader in metal powders manufacturing. Their clients include the auto industry, many other industries globally. And they, in 2017, signed up to the Global Compact of Kofi Annan, and since have tried to reduce their energy consumption and other forms of reducing their carbon footprint. In this year, actually, they joined the Science-Based Targets Initiative, which was started, amongst others, by the Global Compact and others, and have tried to arrive at net zero, or have a strategy to arrive at net zero for at least their inner firm usages here, which is called Scope 1. That's the direct emissions from activities within the firm. And, of course, the other aspects in this hierarchy, Scope 2 and Scope 3. Scope 2 involves the electricity usage by the firm, and Scope 3, both up and downstream carbon intensity, is very difficult to monitor for a firm because you have partners. So the complaint, I spoke with the sustainability advisor for Höganäs, was that there's a lack of incentives for reducing Scope 3 or external emissions or carbon footprint. So my answer or response would be the cooperative advantage. People talk about a competitive advantage, but I think cooperatives as an institution have an advantage here because of the principles. And here is a figure from a colleague at St. Mary's University, forget her last name, Daphne, linking standard corporate social responsibility principles with the cooperative principles. Very interesting to see, again, these in practice. And for the sixth principle, which of course is cooperation amongst cooperatives, there is no corollary. But this, to me, seems to be a tool to achieve Scope 3 reductions by embedding certain principles within an architecture of organizations that are themselves also engaged in business. So again, cooperatives, they're present in every sector. They can fit within this type of a pluralistic economy because they often deal with traditional enterprises, because not every company obviously is a cooperative. And they already have missions. So it seems that there's already something there to deal with. And just some recent research, this was a paper just accepted into a journal by Nathalie Meigne and Joseph Blasi and co-authors, that suggests that in addition to a social benefit, which they found quite a small one there's a quite significant economic benefit within the IT sector to cooperatives, to having a cooperative. And it seems quite clear that giving people agency in a particularly where there's a lot of human capital and training involved, let's not speak about a situation where this is not the case, where probably it would also be the case, but that there would be quite a significant benefit, an economic benefit to organizations that render more agency to the stakeholders, including workers. So people see themselves less as a thermometer and more as a thermostat, and they're able to rather, interact more autonomously with their environment. Again, this would be my second reference to Ilya Prigogine, who talks about the radical uncertainty of the universe. And if we do all face this radical uncertainty, then having an organization where people are working together and not where everyone is sort of dealing strategically with one another would be of great benefit. So this is certainly, one could argue, a form of what is today called relational contracting. We have, two T tables here, accounting tables where there's a firm and a creditor, there are debits and credits, and instead of seeing it in this classical way, instead of having a debit, there are relationships. So again, there's a lot of investment in the long term, in the longevity of those relationships. Well, the point is that whereas you have in traditional accounting, you have there's a amount of money, and there is that is seen as a credit by one and is seen as a debit by another. This is basically time insensitive. There's no focus on the time factor. And I guess according to the traditional view, there would be a contract there, and if there's a breach in the contract, maybe you have a, what do you call them, incasso, so on. So there's really no relationship. There's no relationship. This is these are numbers on a table. Instead, the relational contracting view integrates the relationship into, or attempts to integrate it into the contract as well as it is possible by having, say, certain reflections of the ability to pay. So, for instance, if the firm says, well, we have problems now, maybe we can pay later. So it's the introduction of more informal relationships into creditor and debtor relationships. So just looking at outside the window now, you see the problems in some of the standardized firms. So Facebook, of course, has lost a lot of market value in just the last year since rebranding as Meta. Maybe has nothing to do with that, and maybe just the fact that they have reached their peak of users, so they've lost his users. Amazon, here is a recent article from The Guardian, could run out of workers in the US in 2 years. So if you deal with your stakeholders like inputs, again, if you have this machine metaphor in mind, then I would say there's a limit to the amount of value you can extract. And comparing this, I think, to some alternatives are useful. VME, for instance, is a cooperative, a IT company itself. OSE is another one in Germany. VME is in the UK. Both were traditional firms, family firms, that were converted over time into cooperatives, and both have remarked, or stakeholders from both firms have remarked, the incredible difference this has made in the nature of work, the nature of relationships. Clients have been very positive. VME supplies actually 9 of the 13 consumer cooperatives in the UK with software solutions, and OSE is a consulting firm that has many clients. You can read them here, Ford and Bosch and so on. So the point, I think, is that what Kant would call in the metaphysics of morals a permissive legislation. So to some extent, we need a question of how to get there. We have a goal, but the means are maybe the question. And so Kant made this point with reference to, at the time of the French Revolution, how does one institute a republican regime in the sense of the French Revolution, not in the American sense, within a tyrannical or dictatorial legal setting? And he said this is possible with trust, with certain relationships. 2 examples. John Lewis, a department store in the UK, was founded by Quakers, and at the turn of the 19th to 20th century, it was given over to its workers as a gift. In fact, Patagonia this year was given over to a foundation by its founder, and it with the aim of acting in the interest of the climate. It's an outdoor clothing manufacturer. Some of you may be aware. And the point is, you can, with agency, with knowledge, you can actually promulgate, you can institute such changes, even in cases where you have a quite different, radically different structure. At the same time, I should mention, the Caja Laboral Popular is the finance arm of Mondragon, I mentioned last week, the largest single cooperative in the world. And it claims, in fact, that it's oftentimes easier to start a new cooperative than it is to take an existing firm and convert it, even with an existing client base and so on, to a new culture. So again, these codes, these invested codes, it's very important to design them and implement them in a way that they are resilient in this changing environment. So it may be useful, again, to invest in these types of, again, as I said, democratic choice mechanisms early on in an organization's history. So again, Alex Edmonds, I mentioned, says that the quality of work is important. So not only quantitative indicators, but also, again, things like camaraderie, trust at the workplace. At the same time, Gabriel Levy has, in his master's thesis, called for the need for a democracy index, compressing or distilling 5 different elements to a ordinal value. I am somewhat critical of this approach because it doesn't seem to me to include, or it does not reflect the dimensionality of democracy. So in my own work, I've developed a 3-dimensional measure of democraticity, one could say, which includes accountability, equity, and inclusion. I don't want to go into those here, but you could have an organization like Mondragon, for instance, which is accountable to its workers, but which owns companies in Morocco whose workers are not cooperative members. And so maybe the inclusion of those workers, it would leave it at a lower level. That would nevertheless put it at a higher stage than some other standardized company. And again, if we incorporate the costs to the changing culture, perhaps that would in fact explain that why there is no perhaps interest in the Moroccan workers in being members. So again, it's to me a multi-dimensional idea or concept that is difficult, I think, to reduce to just one factor. But we're open to discuss. So some examples from my own research. Community cooperatives in Italy, I think, are a great example of exactly this type of multi-stakeholder model, and they're the result of a large-scale and long-standing retreat of the state and the market from a lot of communities. So I mentioned 1991, the dawn of the social cooperative in Italy. At this time, a very small village in the hinterlands, you've never heard of it, of Emilia-Romagna, called Valli di Cavalieri, started a social cooperative with the purpose of preventing more people from leaving the town, young people from leaving the town, increasing some employment opportunities for those still living there. And they started a bed and breakfast, restaurant, tour guide company, all housed within one structure owned by all of the members of this community. And this gained the attention of Giuliano Poletti, who was the then president of Lega Coop, the largest federation of cooperatives in Italy, later Minister of Labor of Italy, and suggested that this would be a great opportunity to focus on returning some of the value that the communities gave cooperatives over time to those communities. And so really spearheaded this initiative to start a Cooperativi di Comunità, as you call them, community cooperatives. And so the first formal community cooperative as a legal form was founded in 2014. It was converted from a service cooperative in the small town of Melpignano in the extreme south of Italy. Basically, the point was that there was a farm of photovoltaic panels that was to be constructed. And since the citizens felt that this medieval village would be somewhat harmed by this large field of panels, they would rather prefer to put them on the flat roofs of their houses. So 70 citizens got together and organized a cooperative. They got together with Lega Coop, they got together with the regional government, and a local bank and received a loan and were able to install these panels and sell the excess electricity to the market. Since then, the cooperative in Piñano, this is on the top left here, has expanded to a number of other activities, including refurbishing a local park. They bring medicines to old people in the town who are mobility disadvantaged. They clean and filter water using certain natural methods that they then sell at a cheap price to schools. They have after-school programs. They offer opportunities for employment to disabled people, and so on. So it's a great example where people as far as from Japan have come to visit and study this example, and it has since then spread to many other places. There are about 200 of these now in Italy. It has spread to cities like Bari and Genoa, who are interested in restoring certain districts that have been neglected for drug use and so on, and changing the local environment. The exit to community is one aspect. It was developed in 2010 by the University of Colorado's Media Center. And the point is to move away from the venture capital model, where the result of a startup is either that it is sold as an IPO on the stock market, or on the other hand, it is acquired by some other large multinational. And then, in fact, as an alternative, you can sell the startup to the community, you can sell it to the users, you can sell it to workers, or a combination of these stakeholders. So this has been making some rounds, and there's research by Morshed Manan, Nathan Schneider on the topic. One example of such an exit to community is Eva. I don't know if you've heard of it, if you've been to Montreal. It's the second largest rideshare app after Uber and above Lyft in Montreal. And again, it started as a result of this unique Canadian legal framework with the multi-stakeholder laws that were implemented, I think, in 1997. And so they basically were able to succeed because they invested in their members. So even during the pandemic, they started in 2017. They now have 50,000 riders and 7,000 drivers. Two franchises, one in Ottawa City, one in Ottawa. And basically, it's a blockchain-based technology that succeeded by differentiating itself from Uber. I spoke with many of the drivers. They're very happy. One driver told me, I would never speak with a researcher, but because I love this company, I'm talking to you. So they, in fact, have inspired Drivers Cooperative in New York City, which started as a franchise of this company and has been featured in the New York Times. And, of course, they're very proud that on the top right here, that they are above Uber at the Montreal International Airport. So open science is part of this, I think, exit to community. France, of course, has affirmed its call for an EU tech awakening. 16 countries in the EU have signed up to this, which is based on a notion of open science, collaborative science. Wikipedia, of course, is the most famous example of that. CERN just last month published its comprehensive open science policy, again, advocating for collaboration rather than building walls. And one example I maybe would also mention is in the hills of northern Greece. Vasily Kostakis, a colleague, has developed a concept of an open tech park as an alternative to the traditional ones that have been built all over Greece. And instead of looking at high versus low tech, he suggests we should look rather at heavy versus light. So things like software we should really share. And this is the way of the future, according to Kostakis. So again, looking at these transitional regimes, the idea of legal hacking, you don't always need to change the law to have some benefit. So the notion of employee ownership, the Employee Ownership Association was founded by Oakeshott, a British lawyer in the 1970s for campaigning for more participation by workers in their companies. The UK company law, of course, is very disparate. There are different types of societies and companies. It's a legal bricolage, I guess you would say. Now there's a silver tsunami of retiring entrepreneurs who are looking to get out of their enterprises. And so one of the successes of the Employee Ownership Association has been providing for professional development and education on the part of tax advisors, lawyers, and others who are whispering in the ear of these entrepreneurs. And if these people are not aware that there are alternatives, the thing that usually happens by default is selling to some multinational. So that has been a great success. In addition, there's the Community Shares project, which has helped to rescue a number of, or hundreds of failing community pubs, post offices, and stores by basically rebranding an existing notion of removable shares. It's a rebranding of a centuries-old law, which, however, has allowed for saving a lot of businesses by allowing people in the community to invest in their community businesses in the UK. Smart, of course, here in Belgium, started by filling a need for artists and others working in similar related fields to have stable employment. They developed a surplus. What does one do with a surplus? Investment. So they invested in an international expansion, starting basically independent franchises. I studied the German Smart, which is very different from the others because the German law actually benefits artists to some extent. So they did not have success with the Belgian model. So they have one of the most diversified pools of members. And they have started now a project with the German Ministry of Economy of developing an internal market for sharing services, basically, amongst the members. Mondragon, of course, deals with its employment changes as part of the conjunctural or business cycle changes by reallocating workers instead of firing them. For instance, in 2013, as Fago, its largest cooperative, collapsed in bankruptcy, all but very few of the workers were relocated to other companies. So this is, what could be possible. These are possible strategies. Coop Fund is the investment fund of the largest Italian cooperative federation, and 3% of all profits of Italian cooperatives that are affiliated, and there are tens of thousands of these, go to Coop Fund, which then redirects it to invest in the cooperative development, in even factoring services, turnarounds, new business plans, and so on. They actually, in their scheme for deciding on investments, have social and ecological priorities. So basically projects that have both the social and the ecological impact, as well as making business sense to them, are prioritized. They have focused very heavily on worker buyouts where failing companies, sometimes not failing companies, are converted into cooperatives, and have had success with the Legge Macora, the Macora law, which was promulgated in 1985, named after the senator who saw this through, Macora, and it has had success in redefining unemployment benefits. So individuals who are unemployed can get at one moment 2 years of their unemployment benefits for an equity stake in their company. They can convert it again to a cooperative, and they have had about 1 to 2 of these every month. And the companies have an average lifespan of 12 years, which, if you compare it to the average lifespan of any company, is about 5 years. It's incredible. There are climate funds. I should mention too, Desjardins, a Quebecois bank, a cooperative bank, has the very first climate fund, offering its clients a portfolio option. In 1991, just to tell the story, one member of the bank, actually at the members' meeting, made the suggestion we should do this. And he was the head of a very small branch somewhere in the north of Quebec. And in fact, I think it was 1987. So they worked for some years, and 1991 were able, through this process of collaboration, to develop such a model. GLS Bank, I mentioned last week, similarly has, I think, 1 billion in the climate fund that has increased to 1.5 billion. So it even makes economic sense. Just, this is the last, I think, regional currencies are possible. Instead of just investing euros, one can actually invest in creating new regional currencies that actually keep the flows in a restricted area. Switzerland actually has a currency called Via, nous, us, or we, and 70,000 businesses in Switzerland accept this currency. In the end here, reporting schemes. The EU Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, which will be implemented first next year, 2023, in its general form. In the following year, 2024, sector-specific standards come into effect, has both environmental as well as social reporting standards, and it will affect all companies, regardless if they're in Europe or not, that do business here, that have either 2 of the 3, more than 250 employees, a turnover of more than 40 billion euros, or total assets of more than 20 million. And I've spoken with some businesses that have suggested they welcome this because it sets a floor for moving basically the minimum level and the ability for dumping upwards. One example of a scheme that actually is part of and recognized as part of the sustainability reporting is the L'économie pour les biens communs. Actually started in Austria as the Gemeinwohl-Economy, in English, the economy of the common good. Is a reporting standard that requires membership. So there's 3 steps. You report, or you basically pay an organization to develop the report for you. The report is audited, and then it is published. And of course, this allows companies both to communicate to others what they're doing and to learn about their own progress. And it, again, as I said, was recommended by the European Economic and Social Committee. So it actually is accepted as the sustainability reporting. So, and it has, again, this multidimensional focus here, for instance, on workplace democracy in the area of, C4. There are, for instance, there's information, that's C4.1. There's C4.2, legitimation of executives by workers, and C4.3, co-decision by employees. So, again, adopting this multidimensional view on stakeholder involvement. And so, to conclude, how can we deliver on the sustainable firm? I think that a relational investment scheme and schemes are necessary for what Edmonds calls growing the pie, which doesn't necessarily mean increasing the size of the economy, but rather creating value together rather than debating on who gets what of this pie. Process-based social interventions that can come from above, come from, Brussels, as people say, can actually meet very well individual and organizational activity. So the individual I spoke with at Hugenas, for instance, suggested it's a very good idea. What we're doing is wonderful to be met from the top. We're doing bottom up, and it would be good to meet top-down types of activities. A multi-stakeholder logic, I can't emphasize it enough, and the triple helix approach, I think, are absolutely essential for actually delivering on these goals. Legal hacking, so moving within the existing regime and calling for new legal regimes are both tools to this end. Things like novel equity stakes, which allow one to interact over the long term with the governance of firms, having this type of relational contracting, and taking advantage of local networks. So we have cooperatives in the world. Why not, include them in the dialogue? And again, this notion of economic policy juries as negotiated coordination bodies, allowing us to internalize these. So this is the last slide. Both labor and capital and other types of investors should be leading and participating in a conversation about the appropriate tools for achieving this social and environmental sustainability. And just a parting thought, we should consider the potential for the EU Council presidency of Belgium that I think starts at the end of this year as a potential for pushing some of these things on the EU level. So thank you.